The day my own family called me a loser was the day they accidentally handed me the future they never thought I deserved. I kept staring through the airport terminal window as the jet slowly pushed away from the gate, its silver body reflecting the late afternoon sun before rolling toward the runway. Somewhere inside that plane sat my parents, my older brother Daniel, and my sister Olivia, already laughing together as if I had never existed. Less than 20 minutes earlier, I had been standing beside them with my backpack over one shoulder, boarding pass in hand, believing this family vacation to Seattle might finally be a chance to repair years of distance between us. Instead, I watched my mother calmly slide my boarding pass across the customer service counter and tell the airline agent they no longer needed my seat. She never even looked at me. "Give it to someone on the standby list," she had said with a polite smile. "He won't be traveling with us." At first, I honestly thought she was joking. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I asked, forcing out an awkward laugh. Nobody laughed back. My father adjusted the sleeve of his expensive blazer before speaking in the same calm voice he always used whenever he had already made up his mind. "Ethan, we're tired of carrying you." Daniel folded his arms across his chest. "You barely have enough money to cover your own rent. Every family photo looks like we're sponsoring a charity case." Olivia sighed dramatically as she checked her phone. "Honestly, you'd just make the whole trip depressing." Their words hit harder because none of them raised their voices. They sounded completely convinced they were simply stating obvious facts. I looked from one face to another, hoping somebody would smile and admit this had gone too far. Nobody did. "I've been paying my own bills," I quietly said. "I've never asked any of you for money." Daniel shrugged. "That's not the point. You're 32 years old, working freelance jobs that never go anywhere. You had potential once. Now you're just stuck." My father nodded once. "Your cousin just bought his second house. Daniel made partner last year. Olivia runs her own company. You're still chasing dreams that don't pay." My mother finally met my eyes, though there wasn't an ounce of warmth behind them. "Sometimes people need a wake-up call." She pointed toward the large windows overlooking the runway. "Watch us leave. Maybe that'll motivate you." Then Olivia laughed softly and said the sentence that would echo in my mind for months afterward. "Maybe losing this trip is exactly what a loser needs." They picked up their carry-on bags and walked toward the boarding lane without looking back. I remained frozen beside the gate as families reunited. Children ran across the carpet, and overhead announcements echoed through the terminal. Life continued around me as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but inside my chest something had quietly cracked. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I felt embarrassed. People nearby had heard enough to understand what happened. A little girl holding her father's hand glanced at me with confused sympathy before disappearing into the crowd. I sat down near the window, staring at the empty boarding pass still folded inside my wallet, wondering how many years I had spent trying to earn approval that had never really been available. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had failed more often than I succeeded. Maybe leaving my corporate job to build my own consulting business had been a mistake. Maybe taking care of Grandma during her final illness had slowed my career more than I admitted. Maybe choosing people over promotions had cost me everything. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to convince myself that tomorrow would somehow hurt less than today. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another bank notification or spam call. Instead, an unfamiliar Seattle area code flashed across the screen. I answered with a tired hello, completely unaware that the next 60 seconds would change the direction of my entire life. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and completely unfamiliar. "May I speak with Ethan Carter?" the woman asked. "This is Ethan," I replied, still watching the airplane disappear into the cloudy afternoon sky. "Mr. Carter, my name is Grace Bennett. I apologize for contacting you unexpectedly, but I have been trying to reach you for several weeks. I believe this is the only number we have on file." I frowned. "I think you may have the wrong person. Actually, I am quite certain I have the right one. 5 years ago, you submitted a strategic redevelopment proposal to the Northwest Community Innovation Foundation. Your proposal was never reviewed because the program was suspended during the restructuring process. The foundation has recently reopened the archive, and after an independent evaluation, your proposal received the highest score among every submission." For several seconds, I forgot where I was. The proposal. I had almost forgotten it existed. Back then, I had left a stable corporate consulting position because I believed small communities deserve the same economic opportunities as major cities. I spent months traveling across Washington and Oregon, interviewing local business owners, researching declining downtown districts, and designing a long-term revitalization strategy. Then my grandmother became seriously ill. I packed everything into storage, returned home to care for her, and quietly watched every professional dream fade into the background. After she passed away, the foundation had already shut down, and I convinced myself the project had died with it. "Mr. Carter?" Grace asked gently. "Are you still there?" "Yes," I answered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just never expected anyone to call about that proposal again." "Neither did we," she admitted with a small laugh. "The evaluation committee believed your work was years ahead of its time. We would like to invite you to Seattle tomorrow morning for a private presentation with our board." I looked down at the empty boarding pass still resting in my hand. 20 minutes ago, I had been supposed to fly to Seattle. "Tomorrow?" I asked. "That is correct. We will arrange transportation, hotel accommodations, and all expenses. If you accept, we would also like you to meet several potential partners interested in expanding your original concept into a nationwide initiative." I leaned back in the airport chair, completely overwhelmed. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why now?" Grace paused before answering. "Because sometimes the right idea arrives before the world is ready to hear it. Fortunately, the world eventually catches up." The call ended a few minutes later, but I remained sitting in the same place, staring at my phone as if it might suddenly explain everything. Around me, travelers hurried toward baggage claim while others lined up for evening departures. Nobody noticed that my entire future had quietly shifted in the middle of Terminal C. As I slowly stood, memories I had buried for years began resurfacing one after another. My father had always admired measurable success. Promotions, salaries, expensive neighborhoods. Daniel inherited that same philosophy, climbing every corporate ladder he could find. Olivia built her company with relentless determination, and I genuinely respected her for it. I had simply chosen a different road. I believed success meant solving problems that mattered, even if nobody applauded you at first. Somewhere along the way, my family stopped seeing conviction and started seeing failure. They never mentioned the weekends I spent helping Grandma through chemotherapy appointments. They never remembered that I had quietly sold my condo to cover medical bills insurance refused to pay. They never acknowledged that I turned down 2 lucrative job offers because accepting them would have meant moving across the country while Grandma needed daily care. Those decisions never appeared on a resume, but they defined who I had become. To them, however, all they saw was a smaller apartment, an older car with more than 160,000 miles on it, and a freelance consultant whose income fluctuated from month to month. Standing in that terminal, I realized something that hurt almost as much as what happened at the gate. They did not actually know who I was anymore. Perhaps they had not known for years. My phone vibrated once again. This time it was a text message from Grace. It contained a hotel reservation, a new flight confirmation for the following morning, and one final sentence. "We believe your work can improve thousands of lives, and we hope you will allow us the opportunity to prove it." I read those words 3 times before placing the phone back into my pocket. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I walked through the airport without feeling like I needed anyone else's permission to believe in myself. I barely slept that night. It was not because of anxiety, although there was plenty of that. It was because every time I closed my eyes, I heard my family's voices echoing inside my head, reminding me that I had wasted my potential, that I was behind everyone else, that I was somehow less worthy because my life did not fit their definition of success. Yet each time those memories surfaced, Grace Bennett's final message quietly pushed them aside. "We believe your work can improve thousands of lives." Nobody had spoken to me like that in years. Before sunrise, I arrived at the airport carrying the same backpack I had brought the day before. The only difference was that this boarding pass had my name on it because someone actually wanted me on the flight. As the plane climbed above the clouds, I looked out the window and realized something unexpected. I was not thinking about proving my family wrong anymore. I simply wanted to discover whether I had been wrong about myself. 3 hours later, I stepped into Seattle beneath a cool breeze rolling in from Elliott Bay. The city felt familiar even though I had not visited in years. Glass towers reflected the morning sunlight, while ferries crossed the water in the distance. And for the first time in a long while, I felt possibility instead of regret. A driver holding a small sign with my name greeted me outside baggage claim and drove me downtown. The car stopped in front of a restored brick building overlooking a lively neighborhood filled with bookstores, cafes, and small businesses. It was nothing like the towering corporate headquarters I had imagined. Inside, the atmosphere felt surprisingly warm. Local artwork covered the walls, employees greeted one another by their first names, and large windows overlooked streets filled with people rather than parking lots. A receptionist welcomed me with an easy smile before leading me toward a conference room. When the door opened, a woman in her early 50s stood immediately and extended her hand. "Mr. Carter, I am Grace Bennett. Thank you for coming." She looked exactly like someone who had spent decades solving complicated problems without needing to announce it. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly tied back. Her navy blazer was simple, and her calm confidence filled the room far more than expensive furniture ever could. "Thank you for inviting me," I answered. "Honestly, I still cannot believe any of this is happening." Grace smiled. "That is understandable. Please have a seat." A thick binder rested on the conference table. My name appeared on the cover beside the title of my proposal from 5 years earlier. I stared at it in disbelief. "You kept it?" I asked quietly. "Not only did we keep it," Grace replied, "we studied every page." She opened the binder to reveal notes written in different colors, printed evaluations, charts, and recommendations. Several members of our review committee independently described your work using the same phrase. She slid one page toward me. Across the top, someone had written, "Practical vision." I could not help smiling. Nobody has ever called my ideas practical before. Grace laughed softly. "That is because they only looked at what you had not built yet. We looked at why you designed it the way you did." She spent the next hour asking thoughtful questions rather than challenging my conclusions. She wanted to know how I approached struggling neighborhoods, why I emphasized local leadership instead of outside investors, and how I balanced economic growth with preserving community identity. Every answer seemed to lead to another conversation instead of another criticism. I had forgotten how energizing it felt to speak with people who were genuinely curious instead of already convinced I was wrong. Finally, Grace closed the binder and folded her hands. "There is one thing I have not told you." I nodded. "Your proposal impressed us, but it is not the only reason you are here." I looked at her, confused. "There is another reason?" She reached into a folder and removed a single envelope. 3 years ago, an anonymous donor created a national initiative to identify overlooked innovators whose work had been abandoned before receiving a fair opportunity. Out of more than 12,000 archived submissions, yours ranked first. I blinked several times, certain I had misheard her. "First?" "Yes," Grace answered. "And tomorrow morning you will meet the donor in person. I believe that conversation may change far more than your career." She slid the envelope across the table. My hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was a formal invitation embossed in gold lettering with one sentence printed beneath my name. "Welcome to the Future Builders Fellowship. We have been waiting for you." The following morning I woke before my alarm, not because I had to, but because for the first time in years I was genuinely excited to see what the day might bring. The hotel overlooked Elliott Bay, where ferries crossed the calm water beneath a pale blue sky. I stood by the window with a cup of coffee, remembering another morning not long ago when I had questioned whether I had anything meaningful left to offer the world. It amazed me how quickly hope could return once someone believed in you. By 8:30, I was back at the foundation headquarters. Grace was already waiting in the lobby, carrying a leather portfolio instead of the thick binder from the day before. "Good morning, Ethan," she said warmly. "Did you sleep well?" I smiled. "Better than I expected." "That is good. Today will be an important day, but I do not want you to think of it as an interview." She began walking toward the elevator. "Think of it as a conversation with people who have spent years searching for someone exactly like you." I laughed quietly. "That sounds like a lot of pressure." Grace looked at me with complete sincerity. "Only if you try to be someone else. The person who wrote that proposal is already enough." Those words stayed with me as we entered a bright conference room overlooking the city skyline. Around the large oak table sat 8 men and women from different professional backgrounds. Some had led nonprofit organizations, others had built successful companies, and a few had spent decades working in public policy. Instead of intimidating me, They greeted me with genuine curiosity. Nobody asked about my income. Nobody questioned why my career path looked unconventional. Instead, they wanted to understand how I thought. One board member asked how I would convince a struggling town to believe in itself again. Another wanted to know why I believed small businesses mattered more than attracting giant corporations. We spoke for nearly 2 hours, and every question felt less like an examination and more like an opportunity to exchange ideas. At one point, Grace projected one of my original planning diagrams onto a large screen. I almost laughed when I saw it because I remembered drawing it on my old dining room table beside stacks of unpaid bills while Grandma watched classic movies in the next room. I had assumed those sketches belonged to a forgotten chapter of my life. Instead, they filled an entire wall as experienced leaders carefully discussed each detail. Finally, the conference room doors opened once more. Everyone stood as an older gentleman entered wearing a simple charcoal suit with no obvious signs of wealth or status. His calm presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Grace smiled. "Ethan, I would like you to meet Mr. Harrison Cole." I recognized the name almost instantly. Harrison Cole had quietly funded educational initiatives, healthcare programs, and community redevelopment projects across the country for more than 20 years. Although rarely appearing in the media, he was widely respected for investing in people long before others recognized their potential. He shook my hand firmly before taking the seat across from me. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I have wanted to meet you for quite some time." I blinked in surprise. "You knew about my work before yesterday?" He nodded. "Long before yesterday. In fact, I first read your proposal nearly 3 years ago." I looked toward Grace, confused. She simply smiled without interrupting. Harrison continued. "Your work demonstrated something I value more than perfect business plans." "What is that?" I asked. "Character." He folded his hands together. "Most proposals focus on profits. Yours focused on people. Most applicants wanted recognition. You seemed willing to do meaningful work even if nobody ever learned your name." I felt my throat tighten slightly. I never imagined anyone would notice. Harrison smiled kindly. "The right people always notice. Sometimes they simply arrive later than expected." He then opened a slim folder containing several documents. The Future Builders Fellowship was created to identify individuals whose talent was overlooked because life required them to choose responsibility over recognition. We researched every finalist carefully. We spoke with former colleagues, professors, community leaders, and even hospital volunteers. I stared at him. "You investigated me?" "Only to understand the person behind the proposal," Harrison answered. "We learned that you quietly cared for your grandmother for nearly 3 years, declined promotions to remain close to family, mentored young entrepreneurs without charging them, and continued volunteering despite experiencing financial hardship yourself. None of those actions appeared in your application because you never mentioned them. That told us everything we needed to know." For several long seconds, I could not find the right words. My entire life, I had believed those sacrifices had permanently placed me behind everyone else. Yet sitting in that room, I was beginning to understand that the choices my family considered evidence of failure had become the very reason someone finally opened a door I never knew still existed. Over the next several weeks, my life settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar. Every morning began with conversations that challenged me instead of diminishing me. Every afternoon was spent refining strategies with teams that cared more about long-term impact than quick headlines. Every evening, I returned to my hotel exhausted but energized, realizing that I had not spent a single minute defending my worth. Grace often reminded me that confidence grows naturally when people are trusted to do meaningful work, and for the first time in years, I understood exactly what she meant. The fellowship assigned me a multidisciplinary team made up of economists, urban planners, technology specialists, and local business advocates. Rather than treating me like the newest member in the room, they treated me like a colleague whose ideas deserved careful consideration. During one planning session, I suggested expanding our redevelopment model to include mentorship programs for high school students interested in entrepreneurship. I expected someone to dismiss the idea as unrealistic. Instead, 3 people immediately began discussing how it could be implemented across multiple communities. That simple moment stayed with me because it reminded me how different encouragement felt from criticism. A few days later, Harrison Cole invited me to lunch at a quiet waterfront restaurant. There were no reporters, no photographers, and no formal speeches. He simply wanted to talk. After our meals arrived, he asked me a question nobody had ever asked before. What would you build if failure no longer frightened you? I smiled thoughtfully before answering. I would build places where people stop believing they have to leave their hometowns to build meaningful lives. Every community has talented people. Many of them just never receive an opportunity. Harrison nodded slowly. That answer is exactly why you are here. He explained that the fellowship planned to launch pilot programs in several states over the next 18 months and wanted me to lead the strategic development team. The responsibility felt enormous, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt ready. Not because I suddenly believed I had become extraordinary overnight, but because I finally understood that years of quiet experience had prepared me better than I realized. While my professional life steadily moved forward, another story was unfolding hundreds of miles away without my knowledge. My family had returned from Seattle expecting life to continue exactly as it always had. Instead, unexpected problems began appearing one after another. Daniel's company announced a major restructuring that placed several executive positions under review. Although he remained employed, the promotion he had counted on for months was indefinitely postponed. Olivia lost a significant client after an expansion project failed to meet expectations, forcing her to delay several new hires she had confidently announced only weeks earlier. My father discovered that an investment partnership he had trusted was performing far below expectations, disrupting retirement plans he rarely admitted concerned him. None of these situations were disasters. They were simply reminders that success could change direction without warning. Ironically, during those same weeks I received opportunities one had never imagined possible. Local leaders requested presentations. Universities invited me to speak with students studying community development. Experienced professionals sought my opinion during planning meetings. None of them cared that I drove an older car back home or rented a modest apartment. They cared about the quality of my ideas and my willingness to listen before offering solutions. One evening, Grace joined me after a public workshop where nearly 200 small business owners had attended. As we walked toward the parking garage, she smiled and asked, "Have you noticed something interesting?" I looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "When you first arrived, you apologized before almost every suggestion you made." I laughed quietly because she was right. I suppose I did. "Tonight," she continued, "you spoke for 90 minutes without apologizing once." I had not even realized it until she mentioned it. Somewhere between the airport gate where my confidence had been left behind and this quiet evening overlooking the Seattle skyline, something inside me had changed. I no longer measured my value by whether someone approved of my choices. I measured it by whether those choices genuinely helped other people. As we reached the garage entrance, my phone vibrated with an incoming message from an unfamiliar number. I opened it without much thought. The message contained only one sentence. "We just saw your interview on television. We need to talk. Please call us as soon as you can." Beneath those words appeared the name I had not seen on my screen since the day they boarded that airplane without me. It was my father. For several minutes, I simply stared at my father's message without replying. It was remarkable how a single sentence could pull old memories back to the surface. Not long ago, I would have answered immediately, hoping this might finally be the conversation that repaired everything between us. Now I found myself placing the phone back into my pocket instead. It was not out of anger. It was because I had learned something important during my time in Seattle. Not every message required an immediate response, especially when I had spent years waiting for words that never came. Grace noticed my expression as we reached the parking garage. "Everything all right?" she asked. I handed her the phone. She read the message quietly before returning it with a thoughtful smile. "You do not have to decide tonight." I nodded. "Part of me wants to know why they suddenly care." "And another part?" she asked. "Another part wonders whether they care about me or about what they just saw on television." Grace did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the city lights beginning to appear across the skyline. "Time has a way of revealing motivation," she finally said. "You do not have to rush the truth." The following morning began with another series of meetings, but the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Overnight, clips from the Community Leadership Conference had spread far beyond the audience that attended in person. A national business podcast shared excerpts from my presentation about investing in overlooked communities. Several regional newspapers published interviews discussing the fellowship initiative. By lunchtime, my email inbox contained invitations from universities, nonprofit organizations, and municipal leaders asking whether I would consider speaking at future events. None of it felt like sudden fame. It felt like years of quiet work finally finding an audience. During the afternoon, Harrison invited me into his office overlooking Elliott Bay. He closed the door and placed a tablet on the desk between us. "There is something I think you should see," he said. He opened a financial news website featuring an article about the Future Builders Fellowship. My photograph appeared beside Grace and Harrison following the previous day's announcement. Thousands of comments filled the page. Many praised the initiative itself, but others focused on my story. Readers wrote that caring for families should never be viewed as professional failure. Small business owners thanked me for speaking honestly about communities that often felt forgotten. One comment caught my attention more than any other. It simply read, "Someone finally proved that kindness and competence can exist together." Harrison noticed my expression. "Recognition is an interesting thing," he said. "Most people spend their lives chasing it. You spent your life earning it without realizing anyone was watching." Before I could respond, my phone rang once again. This time it was Daniel. I let it ring until it stopped. A moment later, another message appeared. "Ethan, please call us. We did not know everything. We really need to talk." A few minutes later, Olivia sent a similar message asking if we could meet whenever I returned home. Then my mother left a voicemail. I listened to it only after the meetings had ended. Her voice sounded quieter than I remembered. "Ethan, we saw your interview. We had no idea about the fellowship or everything you had been working on. Please call us when you have time. We would like to explain." Explain. The word lingered in my thoughts as I sat alone in the conference room after everyone else had left. I wondered what explanation could possibly erase years of assumptions or undo the moment they had walked away from me at the airport. Yet I also realized I no longer needed an explanation to move forward. My future was not waiting for their approval anymore. Later that evening, Grace joined me on the building's rooftop terrace where the city shimmered beneath the fading sunset. "You have been unusually quiet today," she observed. I smiled. I spent years hoping my family would finally see me. Now that they do, I am surprised to discover it matters much less than I expected. Grace leaned against the railing. "That is because your identity no longer depends on someone else's opinion." I looked across the water where another airplane slowly climbed into the evening sky. Just weeks earlier, watching a plane depart had filled me with rejection and disappointment. Now it reminded me that every departure also creates the possibility of arriving somewhere entirely new. My phone vibrated one final time before I left the terrace. It was not from my family. It was from the fellowship board. The message contained a single invitation. Tomorrow morning, the governors from 6 different states would be attending a private strategy session, and they wanted me to present the national expansion plan that carried my name. The strategy session lasted nearly 4 hours, yet it felt surprisingly natural. Representatives from 6 different states discussed challenges facing small towns, declining business districts, and young professionals leaving their communities in search of opportunity. Instead of presenting complicated theories, I shared stories about real people I had met over the years. I talked about family-owned hardware stores struggling to compete, local coffee shops becoming gathering places for neighbors, and high school graduates who wanted to build careers close to home if only someone believed in them first. When the meeting ended, several governors stayed behind to shake my hand personally. One of them smiled and said, "You make economic development sound human again." Those words stayed with me as I walked back toward Grace's office. She greeted me with an unmistakable look of satisfaction. "Congratulations," she said. "The board has officially approved the first phase of the national initiative." I could hardly believe it. "Does that mean we are actually moving forward?" Grace nodded. "It means communities across the country will soon begin using the framework you created." Before I could respond, my phone vibrated once again. This time it was a calendar invitation instead of a message. My father had somehow learned the hotel where I was staying and had arranged to meet me in the lobby that evening. There was no request for permission, only a note saying they had already flown to Seattle and hoped I would give them a few minutes. I showed the invitation to Grace. She read it quietly before asking, "What do you want to do?" I took a long breath. I think I am finally ready to hear what they have to say. That evening, I walked into the hotel lobby precisely at 7 o'clock. My family was already there. They stood together near the large windows overlooking the waterfront, looking noticeably less confident than I remembered. My father was the first to step forward. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "I was not sure you would." "Neither was I answered honestly. For a brief moment nobody spoke. The silence felt uncomfortable, but not hostile. It felt like years of unspoken conversations waiting for someone to begin. My mother finally broke the silence. "Ethan, we owe you an apology." Hearing those words surprised me more than I expected. She looked down before continuing. "When we watched your interview, we learned things about your life that we should have known already. We realized how little we had actually asked about what you were doing." Daniel shifted uneasily beside her. "I always thought you were wasting your potential," he admitted. "Now I realize I never bothered to understand where you were investing it." Olivia nodded slowly. "I kept comparing your career to mine instead of recognizing that we wanted completely different things." My father looked directly at me. "The day at the airport." His voice became quieter. "There is no excuse for how we treated you. We convinced ourselves we were giving you motivation when, in reality, we were simply being cruel. I regret that more than you know." I listened without interrupting. Months earlier, I would have desperately searched their faces for reassurance that they still loved me. Tonight, I noticed something different. I was listening because I wanted honesty, not validation. After a long pause, I finally spoke. "Do you know what hurt the most?" They all looked at me silently. It was not losing the trip. It was realizing that every sacrifice I made for this family had become invisible. My mother covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. "We never meant to erase everything you did." "But you did," I replied gently. "You remembered promotions, salaries, and titles. You forgot hospital rooms, long nights, and the promises I kept when nobody else could." Daniel lowered his head. "You are right." Nobody argued. Nobody defended themselves. They simply listened. Then my father reached into his briefcase and removed a worn manila folder. "There is something else you deserve to know," he said. "After your grandmother passed away, we found several letters she had written but never mailed." He carefully handed the folder to me. "Every one of them talked about you. She wrote that you had given up more than anyone realized, and she hoped one day we would understand what kind of man you had become." I stared at the folder without opening it. My grandmother had always believed that kindness eventually found its way back to the people who gave it freely. Holding those letters in my hands, I wondered if this was what she had meant all along. After my family returned to their hotel that evening, I carried the folder back to my room without opening it. I placed it on the desk beside the window and simply looked at it for several minutes. Somehow those letters felt heavier than paper should. They represented years that could never be relived and conversations that would never happen. Finally, I untied the faded ribbon holding them together. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandmother's, elegant and steady despite the illness she had quietly endured. The first letter began with a sentence that immediately stopped me. "If you are reading this, then I hope you finally understand that the strongest people are rarely the loudest ones." I smiled despite the emotion rising inside me. She wrote about ordinary moments I had nearly forgotten, late-night conversations over tea, long drives to medical appointments, afternoons spent reading to her when she no longer had the energy to hold a book herself. She never described those moments as sacrifices. She described them as evidence of love. In another letter, she wrote something that remained with me long after I finished reading. "Never allow disappointment to convince you that kindness was a mistake. Kindness is never wasted. Sometimes it simply arrives at its destination much later than expected." I closed the final letter and sat quietly as the city lights reflected across Elliott Bay. For years I had believed those seasons of my life had delayed my future. Now I understood they had shaped the person who was finally ready to step into it. The next morning I met Grace before the board's weekly planning session. She immediately noticed the folder under my arm. "You read them," she said with a gentle smile. I nodded. They answered questions I did not even know I was still asking. Grace listened as I shared several passages from the letters. When I finished, she remained silent for a moment before speaking. "Your grandmother gave you something very few people receive. She taught you how to measure success without comparing yourself to anyone else." Later that afternoon, I received another message from my father asking whether we could meet one final time before my schedule became too busy. This time I accepted without hesitation. We met at a quiet park overlooking the waterfront. There was no tension, only an honesty that had been missing for years. My father spoke first. Your mother and I have talked a great deal since arriving here. We cannot change what happened, but we want to change what happens next. I appreciated that he did not ask for immediate forgiveness or pretend everything could return to the way it once was. Instead, he simply accepted responsibility. Daniel admitted that he had spent too much of his life measuring people by professional achievements because that was how he measured himself. Olivia confessed that watching my interview forced her to realize she admired my sense of purpose more than any award she had ever received. I listened carefully before answering. I forgive all of you. Relief immediately appeared on their faces, but I gently raised my hand before anyone spoke. Forgiveness does not mean pretending the past never happened. It means I am choosing not to let it define my future. They nodded quietly. I love this family, I continued. But I also love the person I have become since learning to believe in myself. I cannot go back to constantly trying to earn acceptance by becoming someone else. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We do not want you to go backward anymore. We simply hope we can walk forward with you, even if we have to earn that privilege one step at a time. For the first time in many years, I believed she meant every word. As we stood to leave, my father smiled in a way I had not seen since childhood. Your grandmother used to tell me that one day you would teach this family something important. I looked at him curiously. What was that? He laughed softly. She said you would remind us that success is not measured by how many people admire you. It is measured by how many lives become better because you were willing to care. As I walked away from the waterfront that afternoon, I realized I no longer felt like someone who had escaped his past. I felt like someone who had finally made peace with it, leaving enough room in my heart to embrace everything waiting ahead. 3 years later, I found myself standing in another airport terminal, watching travelers hurry toward their gates with the same mixture of excitement and uncertainty that always seemed to fill places where thousands of journeys crossed every day. This time I was not standing alone because someone had left me behind. I was preparing to visit the 10th community selected for the Future Builders Initiative, a program that had now helped launch hundreds of locally owned businesses, created thousands of new jobs, and encouraged countless young people to believe that they could build meaningful futures without abandoning the places they called home. As I waited for boarding to begin, I smiled at the irony that airports had once represented rejection in my life. Now they represented possibility. My phone buzzed with a familiar family group message. Daniel had sent photographs from a volunteer event his company now sponsored each month. Olivia proudly shared pictures from a mentorship program she had created for women starting small businesses. My parents had spent much of their retirement traveling to communities where our organization operated, quietly volunteering without asking anyone to recognize their names. None of us pretended the past had never happened. We simply refused to let it become the only story we told about one another. A few minutes later, Grace called. I heard today's event has more than 1,000 attendees, she said. That is what the organizers told me. I replied with a laugh. I still cannot believe people want to hear me speak. That is because you still think like the man I met on his first day, she answered warmly. The difference is that now you understand your experiences belong to more than just you. After the call ended, I reached into my briefcase and removed the worn folder containing my grandmother's letters. Although I had read them dozens of times, I still carried them whenever I traveled. One page had become especially meaningful over the years. Her handwriting had faded slightly, but the message remained as clear as ever. When one door closes, do not spend so much time staring at it that you miss the one quietly opening beside you. I gently returned the letter to its place, just as the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. As I walked toward the gate, another familiar voice called my name. I turned to see my parents approaching with relaxed smiles. They had booked the same flight because they planned to volunteer at the community event later that week. My father laughed softly as we walked together. Do you realize this is the first trip we have ever taken where everyone insisted on making sure you boarded before the rest of us? I smiled. I noticed. My mother slipped her arm through mine. We learned that lesson the hard way. There was sadness in her voice, but there was also gratitude that life had given us another chance to become the family we should have been all along. When we reached the boarding line, I paused for just a moment and looked through the large windows at the airplane waiting outside. I remembered another afternoon years earlier when I had watched a different aircraft disappear without me, convinced that I had been left behind forever. Looking back now, I understood something I could never have understood then. Missing that flight had never been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of the life I was actually meant to live. If my family had not made that painful decision, I might never have answered Grace's phone call. I might never have rediscovered the proposal I believed the world had forgotten. I might never have met Harrison Cole, found the courage to trust my own voice again, or discovered that quiet acts of compassion could shape a future more powerful than ambition alone. As I stepped onto the jet bridge, I no longer carried the weight of proving anyone wrong. I carried the privilege of helping others believe in themselves before life convinced them to stop trying. That was a far greater success than any title, salary, or public recognition could ever provide. Sometimes the greatest turning point in a person's life does not arrive wrapped in celebration. Sometimes it arrives disguised as disappointment, waiting patiently for enough time to reveal the extraordinary opportunity hidden inside it. I took my seat by the window as the aircraft slowly pulled away from the gate, and as the engines carried us into the open sky, I silently thanked every unexpected detour that had led me exactly where I was meant to be.